Every Friday evening for 9 years, a refrigerated van from Harwick Hospitality Group backed into the loading dock behind Lorne Cadieux's bakery and unloaded whatever the hotel chain's kitchen managers had decided they no longer wanted. Surplus flour already opened, bruised fruit, cracked eggs packed in foam trays, butter that had softened slightly past the temperature protocols Harwick's corporate standards required. No phone call first, no explanation, just a delivery manifest, a receiver's signature line, and a handshake agreement that paid Lorne 40 cents on the dollar for whatever he could salvage and transform. Harwick's regional operations director had set up the contract 8 years earlier as a cost offset measure. The hotels generated waste, Lorne absorbed it. Everyone's numbers looked better on paper. Nobody at Harwick headquarters in Calgary had ever visited the bakery, nobody had ever tasted what came out of it. Lorne Cadieux was 43 years old, and ran his operation out of a converted hardware store on the eastern edge of Sudbury, Ontario. The building had belonged to his Belchou-in-law, passed to his wife Marguerite when the old man retired, and then to Lorne when Marguerite died of pancreatic cancer 4 years earlier. She had been 38, their son, Tobias, had been 7. He was now 11, and he did homework at a corner table near the proofing racks every day after school, while the ovens were still running. Lorne had large hands and moved through his kitchen, the way people move through spaces they have memorized completely, without looking, without hesitating. He rarely spoke while he worked. He tasted. He adjusted. He listened to the sound of crust forming in the oven, the same way some people listen for weather changes. His bread had a reputation in the city that extended well beyond the neighborhood. Chefs drove across town for his sourdough. A catering company in Barrie sent a standing order every Thursday. A small cafe chain in the Glebe had tried twice to negotiate an exclusive supply contract that Lorne declined both times because he didn't want to be owned by anyone else's schedule. The Harwick contract was the exception. He had accepted it initially because Marguerite had just been diagnosed, and the income was immediate and reliable. He had kept it because Tobias needed stability, and stability required money. And Lorne was not a man who walked away from reliability simply because the terms weren't flattering. What Harwick sent him was the kind of raw material that required skill to use well. Slightly overripe mangoes became a compote that sold out within hours. Surplus rye flour that had been exposed to humidity went into a dense, dark loaf that developed a following. Cracked eggs became the foundation of a pastry cream that a local cooking school eventually asked him to demonstrate in a class. Lorne didn't advertise what he did with the hotel's leftovers, he just did it, quietly, every week, and the bakery kept its lights on. He had been doing this for 9 years. He had met the Harwick operations director exactly once, in a parking lot, to sign the original paperwork. After that, it was manifests, invoices, and nothing personal at all. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt like the most reliable person in the room was also somehow the most invisible one, this story is going to stay with you. Please like this video, leave a comment, tells us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Integrity Tales so you don't miss what comes next. Harwick Hospitality Group had been built over 22 years by its founder, a former hotel manager from Red Deer, named Douglas Fenn, who sold the company to a private equity consortium when Lorne was still an apprentice baker in his 20s. The consortium brought in professional management, expanded aggressively into the convention hotel segment, and eventually promoted from within to install as a new CEO. Renata Calloway, who had joined Harwick as a revenue strategy director 9 years ago, and worked her way to the top, with a reputation for operational precision, and very little patience for sentimentality. Renata was 41. She had a master's degree in hospitality management from Cornell, and a track record of margin improvement that the consortium's board found enormously comforting. She restructured supplier relationships, renegotiated labor contracts in 3 provinces, and oversaw the design of Harwick's new flagship property on the waterfront in Halifax, which opened to significant fanfare 18 months before everything began to go wrong. The problems were not dramatic at first. A pattern of guest complaints about food quality at 3 of the hotel restaurants. Then a supplier investigation that revealed one of Harwick's primary pastry distributors had been misrepresenting the sourcing of their product. Then a food safety audit at the Halifax property that generated findings that Renata's communications team worked hard to characterize as minor. Then a story in a national magazine that characterized them as not minor at all. Harwick's culinary identity had always been one of its brand differentiators. The company's marketing had spent years building an image around local sourcing, artisan quality, the idea that a Harwick hotel restaurant was different from a generic chain experience. When that image developed cracks, the cracks spread faster than anyone in the executive suite had anticipated. By the spring of the following year, 2 high-profile catering contracts had been cancelled. A convention center partnership in Ottawa was under review. 3 food critics had written pieces that used the word "hollowed" to describe what had happened to the Harwick dining experience. The stock wasn't publicly traded, but the consortium's internal valuation meetings were becoming uncomfortable. The board asked Renata for a recovery plan. She produced one. The board said it wasn't enough and gave her 90 days. Renata began pulling on every thread she could find: internal audits, supplier reviews, kitchen assessments across 14 properties. She was looking for anything that could be rebuilt quickly. Anything that could serve as a credible demonstration that Harwick's standards were recoverable rather than permanently compromised. During a late-night review of regional procurement records, one of her analysts flagged something unusual. There was a small bakery in Sudbury, with a 9-year supply relationship, that had never generated a single complaint. Not one. The bakery had absorbed surplus and off-specification product from 3 Harwick properties over nearly a decade, and the product it returned, bread, pastries, prepared components, had consistently received the highest guest satisfaction scores of any food offering at those properties. Guests mentioned it specifically in reviews. Conference attendees had asked the front desk where the bread came from. A food writer who stayed at the Sudbury location for 3 nights had written a piece for a regional publication describing the hotel's breakfast pastries as the best she had encountered in a Canadian hotel, and Harwick's marketing department had never even noticed. The bakery was called Cadieux Artisan. The operator was listed as Lorne Cadieux. The contract value over 9 years was modest. The indirect contribution to guest satisfaction, when her analyst ran the numbers, was not modest at all. Renata stared at the report for a long time. There was one more thing the analyst had flagged. The Harwick properties that used Cadieux product were the only 3 locations that had maintained consistently positive food quality scores throughout the period, when every other property's scores had declined. When the decline happened across the network, those 3 locations held. Nobody had ever asked why. Renata called the analyst back in and asked her to check whether those 3 properties had done anything differently from the others, in terms of kitchen staff, supplier relationships, or food procurement. The analyst came back the next morning. The only consistent differentiator was the Cadieux contract. One man, in a converted hardware store in Sudbury, had been quietly holding up 3 of their hotels for 9 years, and nobody at Harwick had ever picked up a phone to say thank you, or even acknowledge what he was actually doing for them. Renata had built her career on efficiency. She was not a person given to sentiment, but she sat in her office that morning for longer than she usually allowed herself to sit anywhere, and something she hadn't expected moved through her. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to the feeling of realizing you've been driving past the same remarkable thing every day for years, and only now pulled over to actually look at it. She flew to Sudbury on a Tuesday, without a communications team or a PR strategy. She took a car from the regional airport to the east end of the city, and stood outside Cadieux Artisan at 7:15 in the morning, in the kind of April cold that Sudbury specializes in, looking at a hand-lettered sign in a window that had been there long enough to start fading at the edges. Inside, Lorne was already 3 hours into his day. Tobias would arrive after school. The sourdough was in its final proof. There was a tray of butter tarts cooling on the rack near the window because a church in the Minnow Lake neighborhood had a fundraiser that weekend, and had ordered 4 dozen. The door opened, and a woman Lorne had never met walked in and stood near the front counter, with the particular posture of someone accustomed to walking into where people already knew who she was. She was wearing a coat that was too light for the weather, which told him she'd flown in from somewhere warmer. She introduced herself. Lorne recognized the name, because he had signed a contract with her company 9 years ago, and had been receiving her company's surplus ever since. He didn't say much at first. He asked if she wanted coffee. He poured 2 cups from the pot he kept for himself, and Tobias's after-school snack, the one that was always slightly too strong, because that was how he preferred it, and set one in front of her on the counter without making a production of it. Renata explained the situation. She didn't use the careful, buffered language she used in board meetings. Perhaps because the room didn't have any boardroom energy in it at all. It smelled of yeast, and brown butter, and something with cardamom. There was a child's drawing of a loaf of bread taped to the wall, above the proofing racks, with the words, "Dad's Bread," written in the careful uppercase letters of someone who had recently been very proud of their penmanship. She told him Harwick was in trouble, that their culinary reputation had eroded, that the board was applying pressure, that the 3 properties receiving his product were the only ones with stable guest satisfaction numbers, and that when her analyst dug into why, the answer kept coming back to him. Lorne listened. He drank his coffee. He looked once at the rack of butter tarts and then back at her. He asked a question that she hadn't expected. Whether the people working in those 3 hotel kitchens were still the same people who'd been there when the Cadieux contract started. Renata didn't know. She said she'd find out. He nodded like that mattered, which she didn't entirely understand yet. Then he said, "What is it you're actually asking me?" She told him she wanted to understand how to fix what was broken, that she was considering whether there was a way to expand the relationship between Harwick and his bakery, not as cost-offset arrangement but as something more deliberate and more visible. She mentioned a consulting role. She mentioned the possibility of him working with their kitchen teams across properties. She mentioned a number that was substantially more than what the current contract paid. Lorne was quiet for a moment. He looked out the front window at the street, where the Harwick refrigerated van had backed up every Friday evening for 9 years. He said, "The reason what I do works isn't because I have some system you can copy and roll out across 14 hotels. It works because I care about every specific thing I make. I know the flour I'm working with that week, I know what the humidity's been, I know what's going to proof well and what needs more time. You can't franchise that." Renata said she understood that. She said she wasn't looking for a franchise, she was looking for someone who could help their kitchen teams start thinking the way he thought. He asked her what the timeline was. She told him 90 days. He didn't say anything for a while. There was the sound of something shifting in the oven, a low, even sound that he registered without turning around. He told her he needed to think about it. He asked her to come back the following morning. She got a hotel room at a Harwick property across town, which under the circumstances, she found quietly absurd. The breakfast pastries were forgettable. Do you think the most valuable people in any organization are often the ones nobody's paying attention to until something breaks? Leave a comment below, we want to hear what you think. Lorne spent that evening the way he spent at most evenings. He picked Tobias up from his after-school program, made dinner, pasta with a tomato sauce, from frozen tomatoes he'd roasted in September, because Marguerite had done it every September. And he had kept doing it, helped with homework, and sat at the kitchen table, after Tobias went to bed, with a cup of tea and his own thoughts. He thought about 9 years of Friday evening deliveries, and what they had cost him in patience, and what they had given him in return. He thought about Tobias, who was starting to express opinions about things, and who had recently announced that he wanted to be an architect. Although last month he'd wanted to be a marine biologist, so Lorne was giving it time. He thought about Marguerite, who had believed without any doubt that what he was building in that bakery was worth building, and who had never once treated his work as fuss because it was small in scale. He thought about the employees at Harwick's 14 properties, who were not responsible for decisions made in a Calgary boardroom, and who were probably worried about their jobs, and what it would mean for them if the company didn't find a way through what it was facing. And he thought about the specific question he had asked Renata, about whether the kitchen staff at the 3 stable properties were still the same people. He already suspected the answer. He suspected it because the reason his bread worked in those kitchens was partly the bread itself, and partly the fact that a few specific people in those kitchens had gradually started to understand what to do with it. They had learned, quietly, over years, to treat his product as something that deserved care. That was the thing that didn't transfer through a memo. He was not naive enough to think that one baker in Sudbury could fix a hospitality company's brand crisis. But he was experienced enough to know that sometimes the simplest version of a solution is also the true one. When Renata came back the next morning, Tobias was at the corner table doing reading comprehension exercises, because it was a PA day, and Lorne had brought him in. Tobias looked up when the woman came in, assessed her with the calm directness of a child who had grown up in a commercial kitchen, and therefore found adults unintimidating, and then went back to his worksheet. Lorne said he would help. He named his conditions carefully, not aggressively. He needed to maintain the bakery. He was not relocating, and he was not available for travel that required him to be away overnight more than twice a month, because Tobias was 11, and he was Tobias's only parent. He would work with the kitchen teams at all 3 of the existing Harwick properties first, in person, and on his own schedule, and they would evaluate from there whether it made sense to extend further. He wanted it in writing that any changes to sourcing or supplier relationships at those 3 properties would require his sign-off before implementation. He didn't want a title that would mean anything to anyone at a board meeting. He wanted a work relationship, not a performance. Renata agreed to every condition without negotiating a single one of them. Later, she would reflect on why. She thought it was because everything he had asked for was reasonable. And because in her professional life, she had spent so much time in rooms with people who asked for things that were not reasonable, and expected her to treat the ask as if it were. What followed was not dramatic in the way that recoveries are sometimes portrayed. There were no press releases, no ceremonial announcements, no marketing campaigns built around Lorne's story. There was a baker from Sudbury, who drove to 3 Harwick hotel kitchens over the following weeks, and spent time in each one showing people, quietly, specifically, without condescension, how to treat ingredients as if they mattered. He told a young line cook at the Sudbury hotel that flour isn't interchangeable, that different bags from the same supplier will behave differently depending on storage and humidity, and that the way to know what you're working with is to use your hands before you use a measuring cup. The line cook looked at him like this was genuinely new information, which it was, and then tried it, and then understood. He told a kitchen supervisor at the North Bay property that the reason their morning pastries were inconsistent wasn't staff attitude or recipe failure. It was the oven calibration schedule, which hadn't been updated in 2 years. He suggested a specific adjustment, and came back 3 weeks later to see how it was going. It was going better. At the 3rd location, in Solstein, Marie, he spent an afternoon going through the hotel's current supplier list with the head baker, a woman named Vivian, who had been doing the job for 7 years, and who responded to Lorne's questions with a precision and thoughtfulness that made him immediately respect her. Vivian knew exactly which suppliers were delivering inconsistent product, and had been filing internal notes about it for 18 months, with no response from above. Lorne took her notes back to Renata. Renata replaced 2 suppliers within 3 weeks. None of this was fast. None of it was a turnaround story in the airport bookstore sense of the word. But it was real, and real things tend to hold. By midsummer, guest satisfaction scores at all 3 original properties had improved further. 2 of Harwick's other properties, watching what was happening, requested to be included in the process. The board, reviewing the data at a quarterly meeting, noted that the recovery in the company's culinary reputation was concentrated in the properties with the longest and most active relationship with the independent consultant. They asked Renata to expand the program. She called Lorne and told him. He said he would need to think about the expansion, because it would require him to bring on additional help at the bakery, and he wanted to be careful about who he brought in, because Cadieux artisans' consistency was the whole point. Renata said she understood, and was there a timeline? He said he needed a few weeks. He asked Vivienne from Sault Ste. Marie if she would consider a transition. She said she would think about it. She did think about it, and then she said yes, and 3 months later, she was doing the morning shift at Cadieux Artisan 2 days a week, while Lorne expanded his consulting work to 5 properties. Tobias, who had moved on from architecture and was now deeply interested in fermentation, began asking his father detailed questions about the sourdough starter and why it behaved differently in summer than in winter. Lorne answered every question, with the same patience he brought to kitchen training sessions. Some evenings they tested variations together, Tobias keeping careful notes in a lined notebook that he had labeled "Bread Experiments" in the same proud uppercase letters as the drawings still taped above the proofing racks. Renata visited the bakery again in late October. This time she brought nothing that needed to be discussed. She sat at the small table near the window where Tobias did homework, drank the too-strong coffee, and bought 2 loaves of sourdough and a bag of butter tarts to take back with her. She asked Lorne, without preamble, how he had managed it. Not the consulting work. The 9 years before. He thought about it for a moment. He said that the work had been good, and that good work doesn't require an audience to be worth doing. He said that Tobias needed stability, and stability needed income, and the Harwick contract had provided that, so he had never experienced it as a hardship, in the way she seemed to be framing it. He said that he had probably been invisible to Harwick for 9 years, because invisible suited him fine. He had Marguerite's bakery to run and a son to raise, and neither of those things needed a spotlight. He paused, and then he said, "What I wonder sometimes is how many other people are out there doing the same thing, holding something up quietly, not because they're waiting to be recognized, but because they decided the thing was worth holding up. And nobody's paying attention until it's almost too late." Renata didn't say anything. She looked at the drawing on the wall. The company did not save itself through Lorne Cadieux. It saved itself through a combination of decisions, pressures, restructuring, and effort, distributed across many people. But within Harwick's internal analysis of what the recovery had looked like, the Cadieux consulting engagement appeared as a fixed point, the thing that had worked consistently when everything else was inconsistent, the metric that held when the other metrics were failing. Harwick's eventual recovery was modest and genuine, rather than spectacular. The Halifax property stabilized. 2 supplier relationships were rebuilt on better terms. The food quality complaints declined across the network. The brand didn't reclaim the position it had occupied at its peak. But it stopped declining, and then it slowly started moving in the other direction. That was enough for the board. That was enough for the people whose jobs it preserved. Lorne kept his bakery. He expanded his hours slightly to accommodate the consulting schedule, but Cadieux Artisan remained what it had always been. A place that made bread that was worth making, from ingredients that deserved care, for people who could tell the difference. Friday deliveries still came, but they weren't anonymous anymore. The manifest now had Renata's direct line printed at the top. Once, in November, she called ahead to ask if he could use a large quantity of quince that had arrived at the Calgary flagship in better condition than expected. But more volume than their kitchen could absorb. He said he could. He made quince paste and sold it at the front counter in small jars. It sold out in 2 days. Tobias's bread experiments continued through the winter. By spring, he had documented 11 different variables that affected the sourdough's rise time, organized them in a spreadsheet on Lorne's old laptop, and presented his findings to Vivian, as if she were a scientific peer reviewer. Vivian read the spreadsheet with genuine attention and suggested 2 follow-up experiments. Tobias added them to the notebook. The drawing above the proofing racks stayed on the wall. The tape had yellowed at the edges. The letters that said, "Dad's bread" had faded slightly. Lorne had been offered, twice, a larger commercial space in a better trafficked part of the city. He had declined both times. He knew where his bread came from, he knew what it took to make it. He didn't need a bigger room to understand that. Some people hold things up quietly for years, without recognition, without complaint, without an audience. They do it because the work is worth doing, and because something depends on them, and because integrity doesn't actually require applause to remain intact. And sometimes, eventually, the thing they've been quietly holding up is the only thing left standing when everything around it starts to come down. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who would understand it. Leave a comment below, and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to Integrity Tales for more stories about the people who hold things together when no one's looking.